Well, good morning and welcome to another week of Journey with Christ. I'm your host, Mark Mitchell, a preaching minister here at the Park Avenue Church of Christ in Charleston, West Virginia. And I'm joined as usual by Steve Fox, a minister for over 50 years. How you doing there, buddy?
Hey, Mark, I'm doing fine. You okay?
Yeah, I'm doing great.
My
Steelers didn't.
My grandpa... Oh, let's not talk football, please.
It wasn't a good weekend for Ohio.
I'm trying to suppress that. Not for Ohio. It's not, no. But shoot, we're not even the best college team in the state of Ohio. So. My grandpa used to say if he felt any better, he'd have to be twins. So that's what I feel like this morning.
You've had a great week, haven't you?
We had, on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, we had 10 grandchildren at our house. And 8 of them stayed all night. So I came here this morning just to get rested. No, we had I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving as Susie and I had, because just having the kids there and eating until you can't sit down.
There's nothing like family time.
No, that's exactly right. Exactly right.
So. And
what I like about Thanksgiving is nobody has to buy each other presents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, hey, look, here's a 12th sweater I got that I can put up in my closet. Stuff like that.
Yeah, well, you know.
We are going to make an attempt, with the help of our viewing audience, we are going to make an attempt to answer a question that we threw out at you last week, and that is that Israel in the Old Testament became very, very exclusive. They started believing that, of course, they were God's children and God's nation, but they were the only ones who were God's children. And you find, as you go through the Old Testament, you find places where that's not valid, where there are people. Well, God was concerned about all people. He made a country. Sorry, not a country. He made a place where a state of being, a state of prophecy, where the Messiah was going to come through Israel as a nation
and reconcile it all.
Yeah. And so they're trying to decide, well, yes, God has a people, but we're their people and nobody else is a part of that group. And that's pretty exclusive. And so before we go hitting them in the head to straighten them up, we got to do the same thing, because we do the same thing. We become very exclusive also.
And here's from some of our beginning conversations before we went on air, one of the other things that Israel did that we are guilty of is deciding the parameters by which God will accept them, thinking to the degree that we know. Mm-hmm. We'll take words out of the Bible and manipulate them to suit our needs so that we can become, again, exclusive, become what some people think we're the only group that's going to make it.
Yeah.
And that's a sad state.
We wrote down 3 things last week, 3 reasons that Israel failed, and then how are we going to keep from doing the same thing in the church. They yielded to a spirit of exclusivism. They thought they were the only ones. They became like nations around her. The primary goal that God had in mind for making Israel was so other countries, other areas could look at Israel and say, we'd like to be like that. Mm-hmm. And they didn't end up that way at all. They let themselves be allowed to become like other countries instead of other countries becoming like them. And the third thing we're going to look at is they forgot what God thought was important.
Yeah.
Boy, we take little tiny things that it's not worth a hill of beans, and make those.
We make them gold.
We make those the standard. And we're going to talk about what those standards are in just a minute. We will fail if we fall into the same traps that Israel did. We will fail if we repeat those things. So how do we correct those ideas? Where can we succeed where Israel stumbled? Mark is going to read a verse that every person who listens to
maybe
this
in
tape,
the world.
it is by far. If you took somebody who knew absolutely nothing, almost absolutely nothing about the Bible, they'd be able to tell you a little bit about what John 3:16 says.
That's right.
Starting with
Verse 14. John 3, beginning with verse 14. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. This is the verdict. Light is come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil. And everyone who does evil hates the light, and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. Certain elements in the Bible that you'd have mentioned that you could spend months, you could spend a lifetime. I love one of the ministers from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I'm trying to remember his name right now, but it'll come to me shortly. But one time someone asked him what was the most difficult verse in the Bible for him to comprehend, and he said John 3:16. I still to this day don't get how someone gives their Son for us.
I'm going to throw this out there, and then I might be 100% wrong. I'm thinking Paul Tillich, and they asked him what was the greatest idea that ever came from the Bible, and he said, "Jesus loves me, this I know."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes the hardest is the simplest.
Now that might be Martin Luther King, or
It wasn't Martin Luther King that I'm thinking of. But,
okay.
it'll come to me.
So what does it say in verse 16 about exclusivism? What does it say that God did? He did something that showed Israel and other nations that that's not what God was thinking about.
That he gave his Son for the whole world.
Oh, it doesn't say God so loved the world that he gave the
his
Jews.
Son. No, it doesn't
For
say
God
that.
so loved the Gentiles that no, it doesn't say that.
God said he said love the world.
For God so loved the Romans. You could go through every group of people you want to put in that blank, but John quotes Jesus as saying, well, God didn't love specific people, he loved the world. So one of the things we have to deal with as a church is we try to have that same kind of vision that's a worldwide vision, not something that, well, we got this little group of people here and they're glorified and they're God's people. You've got the world, period.
Yeah.
That's who God loves. Love for the whole world might be difficult for us, and it probably is, but they thought they were the people of God and nobody else, and sometimes we do the same thing and we're guilty of the same thing. We usually define who will and will not be saved eternally because we think that's important for us to do.
I know.
There is not one person in the world, not one, who has the right to say, Mark, this is your eternal destiny. I'm going to decide this for you. Steve, this is your eternal destiny. I'm going to decide this for you. In the Old Testament, you got lots of stories about people who were doing exactly that. I'll tell you who's the bad guys and the good guys. I'll tell you the ones who are going to be saved and who are going to be lost. And it's real easy to get into that mindset and let it influence your life. You know that woman sitting over there in church? Well, we know where she's going. We know what she's done.
Well, you know, Jesus kept using the illustration. Be careful why you're doing what you're doing. Because he used many times in his illustration, when you live certain ways, you're doing it so that certain people look at you and praise you for what you've done. And you know, he kept bringing up this idea: love God, seek God. If you do that, everything else takes care of itself. Which comes to the point when your efforts are constantly in the defining how you're better than everyone else, or your way of doing it is better than everyone else. You have no context or contact with God in that moment, because all you're supposed to do is love God, seek Him out. Everything else will sort itself out. In fact, that's what Romans 12 through 14 is entirely about. After he goes through this, Paul goes through 1 through 11, salvation plan, why it wasn't just the Jews, it was everyone, and talks about Israel's stumbling part that they dealt with, and then comes to the conclusion, this is what it looks like. Here's where you are.
You must be reading my notes.
I'm sorry, I didn't know.
Did you sneak into my study and opened up the 2 books I got? We sometimes decide that we're going to decide who's saved or who's lost. Our job is not that. Our job is to be the light. And Israel was supposed to attract people to God. God's job is, we in the church and we in the secular world sometimes get the idea that it's our job to make those decisions about eternal destiny. You can take the worst person in the world. You can take Adolf Hitler, for example. I'm pretty sure, I can guess, that he's probably not going to make it.
Nope.
Because of his lifestyle and what he did to this world.
It's a pretty safe assumption. Jesus said you could look at other people's fruit.
That's exactly right.
And determine, well, that's not the fruit that I think God. Well, I know that's not the fruit God's interested in.
Exactly. So you can take the world's worst human being, and it's still not my job to decide the eternal destiny of that person. That's God's job. That's God's idea.
Yeah.
Our job is to be the light, just as Israel was supposed to attract people to God. God's job has always been, Old Testament and New Testament, to be the judge. Well, why would God be the final judge then? Well, He'd be the final judge because you mentioned a little while ago, Romans 14 says we have one master. We have one master to adhere to. And that ain't me, and that ain't you, and that's not the Pope, and that's not all the bishops in the world. That's not the way the New Testament teaches who's going to be responsible for the eternal destiny of human beings.
Yeah, Paul goes on to say, too, let the master decide who's his child and who isn't his child.
Because you only got one master, and he's going to be the one who makes that decision.
He is the one who separates.
Exactly.
Not you and I.
Let's look at another verse in in the New Testament that explains to us why God's supposed to be the judge. James 4:11 and 12.
Okay. Oh. Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? I don't know if you can get it more plain than that.
That's pretty plain. In English, it's pretty plain. It's in black and white right there on the paper, too. There's one lawgiver.
One judge.
And one judge. There's one. No, there are lots of judges. There are lots of judges that could. No.
One judge.
There's one judge, and it ain't me, and it ain't you, and it ain't other people in the church. It's not other people in the secular world. But boy, we like to grab a hold of that and just hold it so hard and sound that we think this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
You know, the part that we fail to grasp is that in James's context here, the judge is the one who gave the law. The judge knows the intent of the law. The judge knows the purpose of the law. That's one of the reasons why I think in verse 11, when you judge the law, you are not keeping it. He says, what is it? Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. In other words, when you make determinations based on the law that, in the way you understand it, you're now judging the law. You're now judging the law, the judge who gave the law. You're determining who's right and who's wrong. What did Israel mess up and do? They determined, they understood what was right and wrong, and how inaccurate were they? Real.
A lot. I think that's just a part of life. Maybe we as human beings are like that. We want to have the authority to be here. What James says, that's God's authority. That's God's way of saying, I'm in charge. Now, I can make decisions about people. But
I can make decisions about myself.
Sure.
I can make decisions about another thing that came out of Romans that Paul talks about pertaining to this very subject. He says, let your faith between you and God, that's what you work on.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because, Steve, over the years, how many times has your faith in the way you understood it to be changed? I asked somebody one time, I said, well, if your pursuit is perfection in understanding of what God's looking for, if you die before you ever get to it, so you don't make it to heaven,
Mm-hmm.
you know, no, I think God judges you on the intent of your heart based on
I think God judges you on the basis of your knowledge. Are you obeying the knowledge that you have?
that you understand.
Yeah.
And I know this will.
He would never expect you to obey something that you didn't even know about.
Or weren't even able to comprehend it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what if you only had, in the first century, I mean, Paul ran into several people that, like the people there that had been baptized in one way, and, I mean, did he condemn them? No. He said, let me help you out here.
He taught them.
He taught them.
Yeah.
If Paul hadn't made it and those people had died, or what about the people who got baptized unto the remission of sin, but didn't make it to when Paul was there?
Yeah.
Did they? In our world, they didn't make it. It's poor them. No. I think God, the God I believe in is gracious. He continues, as he says throughout, I judge on the basis of the heart.
Well, speaking of the heart, let's look at, we read James chapter 4, where James told us there's one lawgiver and there's one judge who's able to save life and destroy it. It's not my responsibility to offer salvation to people. It's not my obligation to destroy life, because he says that's God's role. That's what. And why would that happen? Well, I'm not going to take time to read these, but here are two passages you can write down and read later on. Romans 2 verse 16 says God reads the heart. I can't tell what you're thinking, thank goodness, and you can't tell what I'm thinking, thank goodness. We don't have that ability. As much as we'd like to have, those of you who are married know exactly what I'm talking about. What in the world does she mean by that?
Yeah.
I can't read her mind, and she's over there going, what does he mean like that?
Yeah.
My gosh, he's a moron. Why can't he come up with a little more definitive answers than what he's come up with so far? God reads hearts, according to Romans 2 and according to 1 Corinthians 4. And we're going to look at those passages next week in a little more detail. But sometimes we become just as exclusive as the Jews were. And basically what they were doing in the first century was they were saying, if you take on our Jewish laws, if you take on our Jewish rules, we'll let you be Christians. But you have to be Christians and then add all those other Jewish laws. And Paul said, no, that's not the way it is.
No.
That's not the way it is at all. And basically, that's what gets Paul killed. That's what gets him beheaded. Because he's trying to put these groups together instead of defining them by tearing them apart.
Yeah, the Jews were going to become, they were adamant to the point, yeah, if Paul has to die. I mean, because even Peter would succumb to some of the issues, and and I'm sure this idea, having grown up your entire life understanding that you were God's chosen people, and then hanging your hat on that, and then to come to find out, no, it wasn't. We misunderstood. We made our exclusiveness. We hung our hat on that, and that was wrong.
Well, to use your phrase, we're going to hang our hat on a couple sentences here, okay?
Yeah.
Sometimes we're just as exclusive as the Jews were. What did the Jews do in the Old Testament? And then later, this kind of overflowed into the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts. Okay, you can become Christians as long as you adhere to circumcision. You have to circumcise your babies. We know that's a part of the old law, but we're just kind of bring that over here when the New Testament says absolutely nothing about it. It's important. It's not. It's there and it's not there, and it doesn't make any difference, according to Paul. If you observe the Sabbaths, we'll invite you to be Christians. But you can't observe any other day as being significant. You just have to observe the Sabbath. The feast days that the Jews had, if you go ahead and participate and partake of all the Jewish feasts that we have, then you can be Christians. And Paul keeps saying over and over in his letters, it's not those things that make you in Christ. It's not those things at all that put you in Christ. Because you're being exclusive when you start adding all these things to the list. Now, when somebody says, well, you're just talking about the Jews. We're talking about Jews and we're talking about Israel. But what happens when we become like that? Oh, we would never be like that. We do it every day. We do it all the time. Let me give you some examples that I wrote down. You have a Sunday school, and we don't have a Sunday school. So once you get rid of your Sunday school, or we get rid of ours, because we're not teaching what's right in that Sunday school, then we can have fellowship with each other. Well, that's a big, big circle, because you're going to have a list of a whole lot of things where two people, a husband and wife couldn't sit down and agree with most of those lists, but we're asking the entire church to do that. So if you get rid of your Sunday school, some churches have located preachers, some of them don't have located preachers. I heard a preacher say one time he was a dislocated preacher, and I don't know exactly what that is, but that's what he said. You get rid of your preacher, and then we can have fellowship. Yeah. Because the Bible doesn't teach it. There's located preachers. You get rid of your a cappella music, or you take on your a cappella music, because that's on the list.
Yeah.
We have to debate that. We have to argue that. And see.
And you're not even getting into all of them. I mean, that list is horrendously long.
And you can put the weirdest things on that list that you ever heard of.
Yeah, and everyone out there, or let me rephrase that. A lot of men have been in business meetings where there has been moments where it's almost come to blows, or has, I'm sure in some business meetings, it has come to blows.
Exactly.
Where there was a disagreement over whatever it may be. And I don't understand. I guess for me, it's not that I don't understand. I understand we become extremely invested in some things that are very important to us. And a lot of times those things are things that are handed down from our grandparents to our parents, or maybe we grew up in this in church and all our lives, and this is the way we always did it. And if you go someplace and they do something just different, like, I remember one person talking about the fact that they sung 2 songs of prayer and a song, and then the preacher got up. And someone else, they sung 1 song, had a prayer, and then sang 2 songs. Well, it just threw them off their game. I mean, they were just totally blown away. We convert so many things into
A sacred schedule.
sacred, whatever it may be,
Yeah.
and set it apart and say, if you don't do it this way, you got a problem. It's much like communion. How many ways has that have been divisive over the years
There's a long list right there, too.
about who can take it, who can't take it,
Yes.
how you take it, when you take it, to what extent you take it. Is everybody breaking the same piece of bread and drinking from the same cup? I mean,
Or is the guy at the table breaking it
and then handing it
and then
out.
handing it to you?
Yeah, I was at I was one place one time, and the guy actually had on. There was 4 or 5, 6, whatever pieces of serving trays for the bread, and on top of the top tray was a pile of bread.
Mm-hmm.
And what he would do was he would start breaking it and start putting them into each one that they would hand out.
Yeah.
And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But what's wrong is when you adhere everyone to the way you see it specifically.
For decades, this church, where we're sitting right now in this church building, for decades, they did communion a certain way.
Yep.
There was bread and the fruit of the vine in a tray, and those trays were passed. And people decided, should I do that or should I not do that? And in some cases, in some churches, the elders told people they weren't allowed to do that. There were tokens passed out. You're worthy to take communion. Yeah, here's your token. Well, once you get past that, when you get past the idea that, okay, I'm not supposed to be the one who's making the determination who takes.
Go back to James 4 again.
Yes, there's one
I'm not in a
lawgiver.
job. It's not my job.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And I was going to say something about how we. Oh, I know. We take communion a whole lot differently now than we've gone through this virus episode. And
I still like it. I mean, I really, really like it.
People walk up and get their own bread.
They
get their
decide.
fruit. They decide who's going to take it and who's not going to. If they don't feel right doing it, then they shouldn't do it. But there are different ways to serve communion. There's different ideas about communion. And if I walk into a church and there's one cup on the communion table, those people are Christians because they honestly, sincerely believe that one
That's
cup
important to them.
You told me a little while ago about a letter that the church got trying to defend that and saying you need to be in a situation where there's one cup used in communion. And if you don't, that you're not Christian. Well, that's how we become exclusive. We take the little tiny things that don't make a hill of beans, worth a hill of beans, and put those at the top of the list. And here's a whole list that I put down some things that were a whole lot tougher than communion cups. War. Have you ever had 2 gentlemen sit down and say, I went to war in World War II, and the other guy said, well, I couldn't do it. I couldn't kill people. I went as a conscientious objector. Well, the issue of war is pretty important.
Yep.
You're out there killing people. So if I can do that and say I'm defending my country, okay. Jesus, when he was talking about soldiers, he didn't say put up your rifles and your swords, and he said you keep doing what you're doing and be content with your wages.
I mean, how many soldiers went into Europe and rescued people? Let's say they went into a concentration camp where there was nothing but Jews. You're going to say that act was wrong? I mean, the problem we have, again, we bring our invested ideas and impose them on other people.
Exactly.
And there's nothing wrong. Philip Yancey one time wrote in one of his books how two people with differing views over, say, war. One who is opposed to it, and the other one sees the need for it. He made the most radical statement that made such sense to me was, he says, God is in both ideas. God is in both ideas, because there are we just don't look at war as the first alternative.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there are times where God expects us to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves.
Yeah.
We can't just ignore things.
If I can defend my house and defend my family, then I can defend some other people who are stuck in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So,
or under a regime where their freedoms are mocked. Imagine, I mean, our entire nation here fought a war over whether someone could own someone or not. And do you think these things are complicated? And I know the church at that period of time was on both sides of that issue.
no kidding.
So
There were lots of Bible studies where they were talking
this
about
was
that
okay, and
saying
then
this
this
is
is
okay
not.
and this is not. And boy, that's a tough one on the list. But I don't hear that discussed very much. It's a whole lot more important than how many communion cups you got.
Yeah.
And if people would just stop and think about the rationality of, okay, here's my list. What am I going to put on my list? What am I going to put on my list that's just so silly and so stupid it doesn't even belong there?
And what am I going to put on my list that's going to exclude an entire group of people?
Mm-hmm.
I apologize for that. I'm sure that came
That was
through.
the microphone.
But when we become, as James puts it, again in James chapter 4, read this and read it slow, because it is deep. When you make a judgment where you determine what's the rules are, you're telling God He can't decide who is and who isn't. Mm-hmm. You are deciding. And I find that that's actually all the way back to the Adam and Eve moment in the Garden of Eden, where Satan says, you want to decide what's right and wrong, don't you? And they took the tree. And they took the fruit from the wrong tree.
You want to be God.
You want to be God.
With a capital G.
And I can't find any verses where God operates with committee.
You mean God doesn't go to all the business meetings?
No, I think he stops at the door.
He's probably tired of that a long time ago. I wrote a couple more things down here. If you ever want to get a bunch of preachers arguing about something, put 10, 15, 20 preachers in a room, and then say, today we're going to discuss marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And then get out of the way. And there are some churches that honestly believe certain things, and there's other churches that honestly believe the opposite of that. Here is something that my brother-in-law, one of the greatest men I've ever met, said to me one time. They were having trouble in their church about divorce and remarriage. And I guess there were some instances, where people that were members of that church had really gotten themselves in a lot of trouble because of divorce. And Gary said, you know what I'm going to do for the next 6 months? I said, what? He said, I know what the church teaches about divorce and remarriage. I'm going to find out what the Bible teaches about divorce and remarriage.
Wow, what a novel concept.
Yes. And he made an effort. He studied and studied and studied until he was satisfied with what he thought the Bible taught. Now, there are all kinds of churches that fellowship other churches or don't fellowship other churches because of what they believe about that subject. And there are all kinds of things that you and I decide we're going to put on the list. And in each of these cases, You know, when you believe about Sunday school, what we believe, when you believe about located preachers, when you believe about a cappella music, when you believe about how many communion cups we ought to use or not use, when you believe the same thing I believe about war, when you believe the same thing I believe about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, then you can become Christians. And boy, if that's what we honestly believe, that everybody has to adhere to your list, and then you're going to make it, none of us are going to make it.
No.
And if God's up there picking, and let's say nitpicking, because that's what we do in a church sometimes. We take some little tiny thing and make it into a, what will we do with that molehill? We make it into a mountain.
Yep. We we put our flag down right there, say, this is it. This is all the importance. Well,
Next week we will study how do we take on that exclusive, how do we not take on that exclusive view? How do we catch the worldwide vision of making sure that we don't put people in little tiny groups all over the place and then make their eternal decisions?
Absolutely. One of the, for me, as Paul throughout, and especially in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. That's first importance above everything else. Let's gather around that one.
I don't see how people can argue about biblical topics and whether or not they're important or not important. When Paul writes of first importance,
this is it.
That's it. That's what you hang your hat on.
Yeah, that's what you hang your hat on. In fact, honestly, I think you could say when you get through with understanding that, then broaden out.
Mm-hmm.
But until you got that one, and then bottom line, we also know is that it's not our job to say who's God's child and who it is.
And aren't we glad? Because I know some people that I
wouldn't make it.
I know some people that would that would scratch me off the list. Let's put it that way. But let's leave Susie out of this.
All right. Well, with that, we are going to end. We are so glad you've tuned in this week, and we look forward to hoping you come back next week as we will continue our series now on what are we titling this series? Who's in, who's out?
I wrote something at the top of the page. Let's use that. The church is how to get the church to have world vision.
How to get the church to have a world vision. That's a great topic. All right. Well, on behalf of Steve and I, God bless, and we'll see you next week. We're waving by over here.